And we are live.
Welcome to #EngageMOOC. We are engagement in a time of polarization, and we're talking power, profit, and polarization with Chris Gilliard, Hypervisible, today. In a MOOC, you're never sure of numbers and who's going to show up. So the link that you are watching is a view link, but we are engaged in the chat. We are watching the Twitter, and we want to make these spaces for conversation permeable so that anybody who's watching this can talk to Chris and send in questions. So if you have a question for Chris, either on Twitter or in the YouTube chat or in edX, please just preface your question with an all caps word question. So when we're scanning and talking, we can catch it and see it. And hopefully we'll be able to put as many of those in front of Chris as possible. Welcome. I am Bonnie Stewart in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island.
Hi, everyone. Natalie Delia Deckard, sitting here in Charlotte, North Carolina on a beautiful day. So happy to see everyone.
Hi, all. I am Cindy Richard, and I am in Davidson, North Carolina.
Hi, everyone. I don't think my videos were, there we go. Hi, I'm Annie Sadler. I'm the Digital Learning Fellow from Davidson College.
And I think Ariana might be frozen on us. So maybe we'll
introduce her. Ariana Montero Colbert is in an airport in Michigan. And she is joining us on the public Wi-Fi, for better or for worse.
We can discuss the importance of public infrastructures in this conversation.
Indeed.
And our special guest in a basement in Michigan, I believe.
That's right, yeah. Coming from a basement near Detroit. I'm Chris Gilliard, also known as Hypervisible on Twitter.
We are so happy to have you here, Chris. Thanks so much for this provocation that you gave us today. Actually, if somebody can put that out on Twitter one more time right now, just for people who might be joining the conversation. Chris, your post or provocation for this course opens by framing a story from Howard Zinn about early American colonial racial segregation and stratification by design. So we started the course in the last topic talking about histories of participatory engagement, but even as we move into polarization as a topic, can you tell us, do you think of any of the ways that polarization operates or serves power and profit? Are these new?
Certainly not. You know, and I mean, there's so many different examples we could look at. You know, I think what the difference is, as we often see with tech, is the difference is the visibility and the scale, and our ability to see the scale. I mean, certainly none of these things are new. I mean, a maybe not quite accurate, but I think interesting parallel might be that, you know, violence against Black and brown people by police is certainly not new. But you see the conversation change as we have video evidence of those things, right? And the ability for people to tell their own stories in ways and disseminate them in ways that we didn't always have. So no one who pays attention, and I alluded to this in my essay, no one who pays attention thinks that's new. But the ability for us to see it and to understand it in different ways is somewhat new. And I think that's something to look at and think about.
Yeah, for sure. How do the algorithmic and attention economy elements of our current information ecosystem alter this conversation? So
what I think is, I think, again, what happens is it's somewhat made more visible, right? It becomes a little more obvious that the design of our society, I mean, and to that extent, the design of the tech is built on making that or perpetuating that polarization. So again, so you may argue whether or not America thrives or has thrived on that, right? And so certainly you could debate that if you were so inclined. But you know, so we have people like Tristan Harris, for instance, or I forget the other guy, but there's all these hosts of people former Facebook execs and former Silicon Valley people who are now coming out and saying these exact things, right? So they were on the inside and now they're less on the inside, but who articulate explicitly that the goal of these platforms is to polarize people, and that maximizes time on the platform. And of course, we didn't need Tristan Harris to say that, right? Like, we have Zeynep Tufekci, and we have Frank Pasquale, and we have Tressie McMillan Cottom. I mean, like, we have people, right? But it serves, it's I think it's worthwhile to at least hear them say it. I mean, I'm also very suspicious of some of their motives, but perhaps that's a discussion for a different day.
Chris, I just wanted to start by saying I loved this piece. Sometimes I get in a place where I think that I've thought through these questions almost to the fullest, and then I read something like this and I'm like mind blown. In a particular part, I think it's perhaps like the fourth paragraph, just for those that also have it up on their screen. You say, would polarization be a bug instead of a feature? I want us to consider, and I was hoping to get your thoughts on sort of the reverse. If polarization is indeed a feature of the way that social media works in the current space, what does that mean in terms of the profit model? And what does that mean? Where are we going with this?
So let me back up a little bit for people who are maybe not familiar with that phrase. The way to think about it is sort of the running joke, a running joke in tech circles, or in the critique of tech circles, is to talk about what's a bug and what's a feature. Like, what is a thing? When is something doing what it's designed to do, and when is something doing something that was not anticipated and is sort of an accident, right? So I'm trying to think of an example that's not our example, but one's not coming to me at this moment. But so we might think about harassment on Twitter or Facebook, or let's stick with that one. We might think about harassment on Twitter and Facebook. And the thing is, so the way, and I talked about this in the essay, the way that the harassment policies are designed, the way you can that groups of people can jump on other groups of people, the type of speech that's allowed and not allowed, is designed pretty specifically to in that sense, that the Silicon Valley sense that more speech is better, right? That free speech absolutism, in that what they call the marketplace of ideas, right? That if everyone just gets to shout at each other and argue, that the best idea is going to win out, right? we know that to not be true, right? So in that sense, the ways that people are harassed, polarization, the rise of hate groups, all those things, despite the protests of the people who designed the platforms, and the claims that no one could have known, those platforms were designed for those very things. And so the way I was hoping to think about it, or to get people to think about it, was that if other people had designed social media, or even maybe if they had talked to other experts while they were designing social media,
would to be social?
Yes. Right. I mean, there's bodies of knowledge from sociology and psychology and law. I mean, and on and on, cultural theory, right? That told us that a lot of the problems that we're having, we were going to have. And so they consulted experts, or consulted not white men, to be honest, that maybe those things that are features, right, that they didn't know would happen, maybe they wouldn't work that way. And so, and again, as in that Wired essay that Zeynep Tufekci talks about, that ultimately, in her TED Talk, ultimately the real goal of all of these things is to get us to buy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, if that weren't the ultimate goal, right, to profile people, to track people, to surveil people, all in the in the interest of getting more data on you, extracting more data from you, so you'd buy stuff. If it had another purpose, then perhaps it would work. I mean, not perhaps, like certainly it would work differently. And so that I think is always an important thing to think about, because despite talk about, and so things can be many things, right? So you can use like if it were not for Twitter, no one listening to this would know who Chris Gilliard was. So like, I think even on an individual level, I can recognize its value. But it's also a site where horrible things happen to people all the time. I mean, we can look at how the some of the recent things with the, say, Florida shooting, and those things, because so for instance, I could talk about this one question forever, and I'll try to wrap it up. But one of the reasons Twitter and Facebook work the way they do is because they need to keep inflated numbers in order to tell advertisers a certain thing. So like if Twitter tomorrow wanted to get rid of all their bots, they could, right? But it would make their number shrink to such a tiny proportion that their valuation would be hurt. And so because Twitter exists to sell, then there are certain things that are unlikely to change about it.
Hi, I'm Ariana. I know that I missed you guys when the Hangout started, but nice to be here with everybody. I just wanted to ask you, just following up from this conversation you're talking about right now, as well as in the piece when you really, I think, honed in on the example of white supremacy and the algorithms of protected classes. I was wondering whether, like, what the next step is once we identify that this is what the actual algorithms are, and how we actually destabilize these tech powerhouses that you're talking about, and like the power that we invest in them. Is there anything that we can do to make these platforms work for us, or do we need to create new platforms for ourselves? Whatever you think is like.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so this is interesting. I mean, I think I'm very skeptical of the narrative of the power of the consumer, right? So what I mean by that is I think that ultimately we're going to need some laws and regulations to change some of these things. I don't use Facebook. I haven't used Facebook in over 2 years. But Facebook, I'm still part of Facebook's ecosystem, in that I did used to use it, but even had I never used it, they're because of the structure of American laws, they're able to buy a bunch of information on me and still profile me and extract data, whether or not I want them to. Like, this should be illegal. I mean, flat out. So even for someone who's never used Facebook, Facebook buys information on people from data brokers, right? And so you actually don't have a choice in that. And so whether or not you use Facebook, and we can talk about this with Google, for instance, too. So you're part of Google's ecosystem. Like, it's hard to imagine someone who's never used Google in their entire life. But even if that person exists, in America anyway, it's possible some other places. But even if that person exists, they have friends who use Gmail, right? They've looked at YouTube, right? And so you are part of that system, whether you want to be or not. And so that individual resistance, while I think it matters, is not going to be enough, right? So an example I might use is, like, if I don't drink bottled water, but like if I drank bottled water, like I would not throw the plastic bottle out of my car. Okay. Like, I don't, as an individual, I don't believe in littering. But like so that personal choice matters in a way, but like the biggest offenders, right? The biggest polluters, like, my individual choice isn't going to stop corporations from pumping toxins into the air, right? We need other things for that. But I mean, individual acts, when we combine them with others, like will lead us to demand changes. I don't know if that's a way to think about it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Chris, something that you said just really made me think. I too am suspicious of this idea of the power of the consumer, and I'm a sociologist, right? So the idea that we need systematic structural laws and regulations to be able to counter the power of these giant corporations, that resonates with me. But as you were speaking, I was also thinking sometimes I really like data collection. Sunday and I were having a conversation. I got a Google Home, and she's horrified.
No.
A bunch of people were horrified. She's horrified. Half our audience is like, "How could you?" But it's great because I'm like, "Hey Google, what's the recipe for homemade Play-Doh?" And it's like 2 cups of flour, 1 cup, and it's so convenient. So
You can type.
some of the pushback, because I want to stop naming Sunday. Some of the pushback, right, is okay, but if perhaps they're collecting data, or this Google is collecting data on you, and you don't want it to know. And my response was, well, I mean, worst case scenario, it'll send me free samples of things that it knows that I need.
Au contraire.
That's
Okay.
what I want you to engage with, right? Because I want to make visible why this is a problem, as opposed to it's not a problem for me, so why is it a problem at all? Which is the pushback for the laws and regulations.
Yeah. So this is a variation of what might be called the nothing to hide argument.
That's why I'm bringing it up.
And so, oh wow. Again, I don't want to. It's not a concise answer, right? But like here's a couple ways to think about it. So one thing is, just because I may have nothing to hide, right? And I don't mean I, because like I definitely do, right? But just because so rights don't exist in a society to the extent that one person wants to exercise them, right? Like, so if I don't feel threatened by law enforcement, like if I'm not going to be profiled by like driving in the wrong neighborhood, I don't say like, oh, police should just be able to pull anybody over at any time for any reason, pull them out of the car, throw them in jail. Like, okay, because like we know how that works out, right? So that's one problem. And so what I mean by that is we don't know. There's some very benign and in fact helpful ways that surveillance might work to our benefit. Okay, so you know, if I'm going snowboarding at the end of the week, right? So like if like all the surveillance apparati, I don't know about that, right? I might get discount lift tickets. Okay, that's great. Okay, but what we don't, because we don't have any control over that environment, there's all kinds of ways that information is going to be extracted, connected, and decisions are going to be made about me where I don't have a choice, right? So to the extent that it gets me a discount or a recipe more quickly or something like that, that's great. To the extent that it makes me a target by the government, that I get I'm not able to get insurance, right? I'm not able to get certain kinds of benefits. Let's see. Well, those are 2 really important examples. Like, I'm not able to get health insurance, or I become targeted by the government, which is not you know, kind of this far out bizarre notion, right? This is real. And one other thing, I'm sorry. So, and the other thing is that privacy is pretty important for a number of reasons. But one of the things I say to people is that, so imagine, I mean, if people are familiar, say, with the civil rights movement and the degree to which government resources were marshaled against civil rights activists. Imagine if they had the same capabilities they do now, to target, surveil, undermine people, to act against civil rights groups, to harass people. Imagine if they had that power then, okay? And so in private is where lots of things get hashed out about whether we're organizing, whether we're talking to someone we love about important issues. You know, it's where the fringes of society get pushed, hopefully, to more just arenas. So if we could never have a safe conversation about LGBTQ issues, if we could never have a safe conversation about racial issues, if we could never have a safe conversation about anti-war, right? Then if that were always being listened to, then that affects how we can have that conversation, and how it gets pushed to the public when we're ready for that, right? And so Google is giving you a faster recipe, right? But it's also doing a whole bunch of stuff that you don't know, you can't know. So we call it information asymmetry. You don't know what they know about you. You can't know what they know about you, and you don't know how they're going to reveal that about you, right? Like you don't know how it's going to be.
Know that,
yeah.
Which is why
you don't know how it's going to be recombined,
yeah.
and
I think
you
that's
have
a great
no
way to address the
say in
question.
that, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, sorry,
I think
super long answer.
No, straight up, that's yeah.
So we won't be getting any Google Home ads,
Google.
sponsorship here at EngageMOOC, apparently. A point that Mike Caulfield actually just made in the chat is we should be able to use Google Home without data extraction, right? And the fact that that isn't an option, that isn't a possibility, that information asymmetry is just baked in to how all of this is designed is something that we as a society seem to have kind of accepted and been like, oh, it's probably fine. And I think we're still going to be reaping the effects of that, probably for working out the effects of that for a long time. In the chat, Khalid asked a question around sort of how tech giants and social media giants play a role in polarization. And I think part of it is what you were just talking about, and also the ways in which they have spread over so much of our public infrastructure. You know, like they have taken over these roles in society that just were not designed. They've just kind of become something that exists. There was another question in the chat, just a second, and it was around how far can polarization go, Chris? And like the second piece of that is, isn't there a danger that at some point it's going to ignite violent actions? Well, I would say it already has.
Right. Yeah.
This is from a person who's in Israel, so in a different context. But what are the contexts that you're seeing where there's violence related to polarization?
I mean,
online or
off? I think the mass organization and deployment and rise to power of white supremacy, you know, and I think from my perspective, it's important to again note that this is not new. Okay, so you could follow, Southern Poverty Law Center or a number of other groups who track, I think Jesse Daniels, who I mentioned in the essay, and I quote in the essay, is a really important source, who look at white supremacy, how they organize online. But I think something has changed, for instance, which is that that online organization. So Daniels wrote her book in 2009. And one of the things she said, I mean, the book is incredibly prescient in a lot of ways. But one of the things she says that actually turned out, unfortunately, to not be true is that she didn't see these groups rising to power. Okay. So, like, I don't know what your feelings are on some of the groups or people in power, but it would be hard to say that there are not prominent white supremacists in power in America. I certainly wouldn't make that argument. And so we see how it goes, right? And even I think what's changed on another level is I don't think that white supremacy and racism ever went away, but there was like a tiny period of time where it was at least it's what I might call polite society, right? So that or so that it was known to not express certain ideas in public, or also you knew that you might get your teeth knocked in or lose your job or something like that. Like, and we're moving backwards as far as that goes. And I think the ways that people felt free to, I'm uncomfortable with this distinction in some regards, but I'm going to use it here. The way that people have felt free to express themselves online has moved to, real life. And so how far can it go? I mean, it can go pretty far.
Yeah, it can. There's another question here from the chat from Hannah. Have you seen the movie The Circle?
I read the book. I did not see the movie.
Okay. She's wondering, what did you think? I guess book, movie, I don't know how close they are because I haven't read or seen. What did you think of its depiction of a surveillance state? And did you think it was irresponsible, potentially?
I thought it was pretty accurate. I mean, again, I have tremendous skepticism, and you might even go so far as to say distaste for a lot of the leaders of the tech movement. I mean, the figureheads like Mark Zuckerberg and Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And I mean, to take Zuckerberg for instance, right? The notion that I mean, he's been on record as saying like that, Facebook has caught a lot of flack over and over again for what they had, which was called a real name policy. And so Zuckerberg's on record as saying that to be a different person at work and at home and with different groups of friends means you're like inauthentic, right? And so that his goal, right, is to be more, have everyone be more open. I mean, which is an interesting thing coming from a guy who buys all the houses around him, so his neighbors can't look in on him. But anyway, that sort of like radical openness works for some people, right? If I'm a billionaire, I mean, there are no radically open billionaires, by the way, right? Because you get to decide. But for everyone else, we don't. And that radically open idea, again, it doesn't take into account how people aren't safe in the world. Right? There are reasons I don't want my employer to know certain things about me. There are reasons, a gay teen in Oklahoma may not want people to know certain things about them, right? And on and on and on, right? And it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, right? It means that you want to have some autonomy in determining who gets to know what about you.
Chris, one thing that really resonated with me when I was talking to the Highlander folk about these kind of historical models of building community and understanding the power structures, important part of the work that they do. And I think your article really brings that to the forefront, that they are power structures. And so I guess my question is, as individuals, how do we come together to understand those power structures? And you probably do this with your students. So what are some of the kind of starting points to look at those things in order to change either in a group or make some sort of difference individually?
Well, I think an always an interesting question, to ask people is who gets to tell your story and who gets to make decisions about you and based on what information. And I think many people, I mean, I would hazard to say most, they want to be the agents of their own story. And what one of the things that a lot of these platforms take from us is that ability to do that. Because again, Facebook, Google, Instagram, and again, I want to stress this point. Like, there is a degree to which we give them information, but that is not the whole story. So they are constantly taking information from you. It's such that you don't even know what information you're taking. And even people who are experts, will routinely be surprised, when like the dictionary.com app is tracking your location, or, the way when you download updates for certain apps on your phone, like you have to go back in and change all the privacy settings. And so all this information is constantly being sucked up from people and recombined in ways that they don't have a choice about. Decisions are being made about them, assumptions are being made about them, what kind of loan they might get, or what kind of house they might buy, or what kind of college they might be able to go to. Like, all these things are being affected by the fact that information is being taken from them and recombined by companies that are just out there. And I think when you frame it that way, I think it changes the way, and in my experience with my students anyway, it has the ability for them to change the way they think about it, because nobody likes, this is typically, people don't like the idea that a bunch of decisions are going to be made about them based on information that they didn't have a say in whether or not people have that information. And so I think that's a good sort of entry point into thinking about it. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that is helpful.
Okay.
Starting from telling your own story and connecting it there. Thank you.
I have something from the chat. Janine made a comment, and then Paul Bond followed up sort of with a related question. She mentioned mainstream media is actually very polarizing already. So we have been talking particularly about sort of social media and web polarization, or as a driver of the particular polarization that we're seeing, while recognizing that polarization is as old as humankind. But the ways in which social media fits into a larger media info ecosystem is important. And Janine mentioned mainstream media is very polarizing for those who only get their information from TV. Our legislatures, our government houses are full of polarizing dialogue. So you've got this sort of perfect storm. And then the follow-up question that Paul Bond said was, mainstream media less polarizing when media ownership was less consolidated. What do you think about that?
That's interesting. I mean, how long has, F News been around?
20. I looked it up. 22 years. And
I mean, because some of these techniques have been, perfected by talk radio and certain news channels. And it's interesting because I think one of Facebook's sort of to jump back to them for a second, one of their solutions has been that they're going to privilege local news stories, which I don't know. Well, I think it's important to say I don't know when I don't know. I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure that I agree with that. That it's that less consolidation means less polarization, because again, one of the things that I think it's important to note is the degree of visibility, the degree to sort of audit or understand what's going on. And so I don't necessarily know that I agree with that. I think that we're able to see things much more clearly now. And I think people are able to tell their stories and get their voices heard in ways that are not the same. And so the idea that polarization is more now is, so because more people are able to talk about it, right, and see it, like, it seems like it's more, but I don't know that it's more.
Right. We may simply have existed in much stronger filter bubbles before we started talking about filter bubbles.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
I have a question that kind of brings us back towards the beginning of this conversation. We were talking about the individual and how one action of might not be enough. And that's a debate that I find really common amongst like environmental movements, where just because I'm taking shorter showers doesn't mean that I'm changing the larger structure that I'm working in. And so thinking to the connections between environmental movements and this kind of situation we're in with all this digital media stuff, do you think there will be a point at which we talk about data privacy and these larger companies the same way we talk about like oil companies and climate change, where we have like a larger understanding that this is a problem that we need to address through our government structures? Where are we in that kind of timeline with this stuff?
That's interesting. I think we're pretty early. I mean, my answer is I hope so. I think that you know, it's important to remember that most of these companies are around 10 years old, you know, 15 years old or something like that. So in that regard, we're pretty early in. You know, I'm hoping that that's the case. And again, this comes from an American perspective, but we kind of don't have a functioning government. You're not supposed to say that out loud, but we sort of don't. Not from not in a federal sense. I mean, so I mean, there's lots of local initiatives. You know, for instance, like facial recognition. I mean, in Illinois, like they actually have some laws that cover it. Whereas in most states we don't. So, and in that regard, if you think about the environmental movement, right, some of that is going to come from local communities, right, demanding that your local community, that your neighborhood gets recycling and things like that, right? So we'll see. We may see that. You know, I don't like this term necessarily, but we may see more of those grassroots things in terms of dedication to privacy. And if we can even look to the EU and you know, some of the laws that are taking place there, that are being put into effect there, which are going to make companies like Google and Facebook, you know, Twitter, whoever, platforms, change the way they do things. So it is possible, but we're really behind the curve on that. But I think the environmental movement is a good example, because again, I think, you know, I'm never going to say individual action is important, right? But I can't, you know, there's no individual alone, right, who can defeat the surveillance state, right? Just in the same way that, like, you know, if I want to have clean water, like there are a lot of other things that have to happen for me to have clean water or clean air, or you know, food that is not poisoned. I mean, like those can't be individual things, right? No matter what a libertarian tells you.
So I'm going to jump in there. There's a comment in the chat from Stephen Down saying, I think that what's wrong here is not so much the collection of information about me, but rather the way that information is used in order to perpetuate discrimination against me. And I think that lines up with some of what you're saying. So I want to build on that. So given that polarization, which is as old as the hills, right, is basically goes back to us-them divides, are the solutions to this discrimination, inequalities, and abuses that are maybe just being amplified or at least made more visible through particular current technologies, are any of the solutions technical, or do we need political solutions? You know, do you need a functioning government? You know, here in Canada, we at least have a different government structure that I would say is not quite in the situation that yours is at the moment, although some of the drivers are already moving towards pushing the kind of polarization that makes a polity unable to function. What do we do now?
You know, I mean,
please solve this.
I do think that lots of the solutions we already know what they are. I mean, it's having individual and institutional and political will to affect them. I mean, certainly, like better tech would help us, right? I mean, so like a better use of it, better understanding of it, better design, right? And people who don't, I mean, who, you know, people who look different and come from different backgrounds also having a say in how tech works. Again, I'm never going to say that doesn't matter, but and you know, here I'm almost going to seem like an optimist, right? But like one of the reasons I started with that Howard Zinn piece in the beginning, right, is that even then, right, that we know that well, let me use this example, right? So even when I didn't have a kid, right, I understand that public education is a good for everyone, not just me, not just like people with kids, right? I understand that like roads are a public good, right? That parks, that you know, all these things that like even if I might not use them, that they're good for society. Um, that having people healthy or having people who don't have to show up when they're sick, that's actually, you know, whether or not that's me, like that's actually good for me because like now I'm not having someone sick serve me my food or you know bring my mail to me or whatever the case may be. Um, so we know some of the solutions, right? Like we know that there are such things as public goods, or at least some of us know that. And we've kind of gotten away from that. I don't know the way back to that.
Well, I think that the point that you're making gets really to the heart of why polarization is effective in maximizing return on capital. Because the more that there's an us and a them, I want public goods for us, but I don't want to pay for their public goods. I mean, look at the wholesale abandonment of the public school system. You
Yeah.
know, the one they go to.
Right.
Or even the roads. This is why the original sort of the original public good is public health, because it doesn't matter if they are the poor, they can still give me cholera. And so the first systems that you see in public health, I'm wondering if we can talk about polarization as a targeting. I think that Simon Ensor says this. I'm wondering if you can speak to the idea that maybe it's not just a separation, but rather that one side is being effectively targeted and marginalized. I think you imply this, but I'd like to hear sort of more of your thoughts about it.
Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, that's a brilliant point that you made. And I think one of the things that's changed is that, and again, I'm hesitant to use this example because it's in some ways it sort of, what's the word? It mythologizes, you know, the middle class and capitalists in a way I'm not really comfortable with. But one of the ways that like capitalism has changed is the extent to which it's now not super necessary to have like a class of people who could buy your stuff. Like and so some of the things that we understood as public goods, right? So that I mean uh some of the ways that we thought about like how society was supposed to function is that, you know, if people could, you know, if there were a middle class who could buy stuff, that was kind of better for like the super rich, right? Well, there's like all these super rich who don't necessarily need us anymore. um so I think that yeah, I think again like the notion of public good is one that at least since the 80s has been consistently attacked um in a oh go ahead, Natalie.
I I want to push back a little bit on the idea that that it's a myth that there's a class of super rich that need to sustain a Fordist middle class that can buy their things, or else you end up in sort of this crisis of demand.
Yeah.
You can take away a bunch of public goods and create demand, force demand, coerce demand. And I think that's the story of the deterioration of public goods. If we are moved to target the slightly more marginalized, then we have to create our own system of private schools that we have to pay for, creating money. If we imagine this crime emergency, right, then we are forced to have private prisons and spend a ton of money incarcerating people. I mean, that's about polarization, I think.
Yeah.
I just want to push back on the idea that that's a myth.
Well, okay, so help me out. Like, what part? And like, what part is the myth?
Well, the way that I understood what you were saying is that it's a myth that the super rich need to support an active middle class, but
Mm-hmm.
because they no longer need people to buy things, they no longer need to to have a whole consumer base
Yeah.
to sustain them as super rich. I think that they still do need a bunch of people
Yeah.
buying a bunch of stuff. And what we're seeing in polarization is the movement away from public goods.
Mm-hmm.
So now you need people buying. Let's talk about the Flint water crisis.
Yeah.
I took away water, so now a bunch of people who aren't middle class still have to buy bottled water,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone makes a ton of money.
Yeah, this is interesting. And this is something really I think to tease out.
I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, like so, and what I mean, I guess how I might qualify that instead is to say that we don't need a middle class to buy things.
And I'm gonna stop pushing back and agree with
Yeah.
you.
So help me. Yeah. Thanks for helping me articulate that a little better.
No,
Because everybody needs water, right? No
Right,
matter,
like,
even if you got no money, you're
yeah.
still going to have to buy water if there's no public water.
Yeah. So like, people are still going to buy things because, like, you know, I mean, they're still necessities, and there's still going to be value extracted from people in all the ways that it can be. But the notion that there, like, the bulk of that is going to come from a middle class that we need to sustain, I would argue that that's gone. So
I would agree
yeah,
with
I totally agree with you. So thanks for making that point.
I think we should go to a question from the questions. Dan Chan asks, why is the polarization in media so much worse online and maybe in the mainstream media than when we sit across from people in real life and debate? What are I think that's an interesting question.
I mean, you know, I think our modes for existing online are very different. You know, I mean, and again, one of the things I'll point to is, I mean, you know, I mean, we used to call them, I don't know how you might refer to it now, but like keyboard warriors, you know. I mean, if you sit across from someone or sit next to someone, there's some very real risks, and you know, from saying things. I mean, certainly people would say something to me online that they would, you know, in most circumstances would not say to my face, right? But, you know, setting aside the threat of violence, I mean, I think even people, like terrible people online, don't necessarily want to see the real effects of saying that to a person face to face, right? Because then you have to deal with people's emotions, right? Then you have to see, like, and feel, you know, how that affects people. Um, I think that, and again, like the design of those things, such that there's limited to no punishment, or you know, you know, there's limited to no um, what's the word I'm looking for? Repercussions for behaving in awful ways. And I mean, a lot of this comes from a lot of the tech that we use comes out of this culture that you know, doing things for the lulz, right? Or you know, right, to do things to get a rise out of people. And so the people who are, you know, developed a lot of this stuff, like that's the culture they came out of. And so of course that would be baked into how the technologies were developed and designed.
Can I push on that a little bit though? Like on the question itself, that the idea that polarization is necessarily worse online. I do think it's often more visible online, because when you have mixed kind of, if you think of polarization in an us-them way, and if you're mixing, you know, us's and them's, then you're going to see that become visible. But if you sit, I mean, all of us have our own in-groups, right, in our multiple alignments as people. And if you're in an in-group conversation, particularly an in-group that has power, and they're talking about a them, you hear some really ugly things. You know, I'm sure that across gender lines, across racial lines, across the way Canadians talk about Americans is just terrible, but I wouldn't tell you to your face. It's not really necessarily, sometimes it is. But, you know, like we all have those pieces, and every now and then you will see, there's a term for it and I can't think of it offhand, but where you see somebody using their inside voice in the wrong context, and suddenly it's a huge issue, right? Now we have these, I call them like, I don't think we just have context collapse in social media. I think we have collapsed publics, where you've got whole publics that really have not developed ways of using their inside voices together. And so everybody's kind of fighting for dominance, you know, over the narrative. And that to me is the ugly piece of it. That's where that ugliness comes from. It's not that there isn't ugliness offline. It's just not as visible, maybe.
Yeah.
I want to tag something on the end of that that I just thought of, but I've been toying with tangentially for a couple of days now, mostly because of hashtag engagement. Maybe the conversations haven't become more polarized. They're just more visible when you can see them in public social media settings. But maybe that also represents the ways in which, for the last 200 years, we've subtly rendered voiceless, marginalized people. So they've been fighting back, and the public discourse has only heard Charlie Brown's teacher. And now suddenly we're in this really public space, and it's impossible to just do that, to just move the conversation forward in the nation as a whole, as though it had never happened. And so we understand it as more toxic and more polarized, but perhaps it's more egalitarian. I know everyone can get mad at me now.
Well, one of the things I wanted to, the other thing I wanted to include in that essay was, you know, post the American 20, how long has it been? 2016. I feel like it was 20 years ago. 2016 election, there was a what's become to be a fairly famous Saturday Night Live skit with Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock, and they're at a party and they're watching the election results, and you know, everyone, like most of the people at the party are white. And they're talking about, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing that ever happened to America. You know, this is terrible. And Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle are kind of standing behind the people on the couch, like, what are they talking about? You know, that like that. You know, to piggyback onto your point, Natalie, that so much of this, I agree, is that the ability of more people to, you know, I mean, it's the double-sidedness of a lot of the platforms, right? The ability for people to make their voices heard, you know, in a way that previously was not, and make people listen, right? In ways that previously weren't necessarily available. It does make it seem different.
Yeah, I remember a related comment that had come up during our Twitter chat on Friday. Rosie had brought up this idea when we were talking about the Overton window and talking about how that changes when we put things into a digital space. And she had said it as the Overton window is built on context. Some things just aren't said in certain groups. With social media, you don't always know your context. So your audience, so the context is dissolved. And I think that really speaks to the point of what we're talking about right now, this idea that digital platforms are totally changing, and mainstream media is totally changing the way and who we get to hear and what becomes our audience. So,
yeah.
And I think that we actually just had an incident in our YouTube chat comment section right now. I don't know if Sandy or Annie, who are actually on the account, want to talk about it more, where something was actually flagged as needing to be approved because it used the word racist in the comment, which I feel like speaks directly to the subject matter of what we're talking about in this entire hangout, this idea of what algorithms pick up as something that needs to be protected from. So I don't know if anybody wants to speak to the context of that more or anything, but I just thought that was really important to just bring up right now. So
I'm so happy that you explained what happened with that, because I think I'm sort of a step behind when it comes to how things get flagged and how the algorithms end up working. But this idea that racism is an accusation that one needs to be protected from, which is morally equal to racist actions, but more easy to flag and shut down. I think that says a lot to how algorithms work to further institutionalize existing power hierarchies. What's been going on for 200 years in a less mathematical, predetermined way is now the status quo. And obviously, yeah, that's horrifying, right? Yeah, thank you. Chris, I just want, in the last 3 minutes that we have you on here, to potentially engage with the content of that comment from one of our viewers. To what extent are people who are difficult personalities online the same people who are difficult personalities? I'm saying difficult personalities is a euphemism.
You can go read the comment.
Yeah, that's true. Offline, right? And maybe thinking of the character of these particular participants as being fundamentally different because they're keyboard warriors ignores that the power that they've had in real life for their entire lives before they were on the keyboard in more private settings where they were actually more influential. Maybe just putting them out there disempower them. Last part.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, so there's systemic racism in ways that are not necessarily visible. Why didn't I get the job? Why was I treated a way in a particular instance? In ways that, why was I denied a loan? I mean, there's I certainly don't want anyone to think that I don't think that there are racist acts or racist structures that are that exist and have always existed and will unfortunately continue to exist. But I do think that there's different ways to enact those online and in person and structurally, right? So the amount of times that I've had someone say something. I mean, to a small extent, right? I'm in a somewhat privileged position, right? I'm like a, able-bodied Black male who just some people aren't going to say some things to my face, right? Like I have lived that tiny bit of privilege. That doesn't mean that they're going to not be racist, but it's not going to happen in certain ways at certain times, right? Moving that online changes that, because it just does. I mean, like I'm trying to not. I'm trying to be very careful in how I say that. Right? Like, I'm not a violent person, but like, there are just some things that people feel free to say certain times and not other times.
I love the point that you're making because it resonates with me, right, as a woman of color living in this world. And I've said this to students, I've said this to friends, I've said this to family. The number of times that I've experienced overt racist slurs, I can count on two hands.
Yeah.
And let me tell you that I absolutely prefer it to the knowledge that people that smile to my face will incarcerate my son, will systematically undereducate my daughter. It will do all of these things while thanking me for stopping by.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
you know,
yeah, so
leave
that was like so
colorblind
much
racism
better than
alone.
I put it. Like, thank you.
No. But I mean, I'm on the same page with you. To what extent does all of the bickering and all of the polarization that's occurring on Twitter that is frankly racist part of the former problem and not part of the latter? I don't know. I have no idea how to answer that. But the idea that you're disaggregating the two, that's really important for this conversation.
Yeah.
Bonnie, I want to turn it over to you because I know that it's 2:00. And Chris, I want to
Okay,
thank you
I
for
have
your
a quick
time.
point. I have a quick.
Oh, go. Sorry. Sorry.
I think that I can. An example that might work is how, like, as instructors, right, as teachers, like, how many times has a student like challenged me, like, in a way that they thought they were going to physically intimidate me? Like, it's never happened, right? Well, you know, it hasn't happened. You know, as instructors, you might have different, as professors, like, you may have different stories, but like a student's never come to me and like, well, you really need to change this grade, right? Like, that's never happened. And so, right, I don't think that my students, like, I mean, like, having taught for 20 years, I'm sure that I've had students who thought that I wasn't as smart as I should be, like, or like a white professor would have been better, or whatever the case. Like, the chances that they're going to actually say that to me are lessened because of what I look like and how much I weigh, right, and things like that, right? Like, they just are. Like, and I think those are important to, like, to take into account, right? But like, what they said about me in text or, you know, email to other people is probably very different.
Right. These are really interesting places to close, because in a sense there's a little kernel maybe of hope in what Natalie said around, maybe we are putting some of this out there. Now we need to find ways to address it, deal with it, systematize our society, you know, broadly, globally, differently, in order to maybe get past a lot of these histories of polarization. I'm not sure we can ever leave it fully behind, but at least finding ways that we need to go forward. I want to thank you, Chris. I want to thank everyone who's here. I want to thank everyone who's been watching and in the chat. Those were great comments, great questions. This will be live on edX. Sorry, it will be recorded, but visible on edX in topic 2 from here on out. And our next live events, this coming Wednesday, we have a live Ask Me Anything chat, not verbal, not video, but just questions for Zainab Tufekci. For Wednesday at 10 a.m. EST, is that correct? Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m.? Yep, okay.
Yeah.
And so if you're engaged in the course, or even if you just want to put questions out there on the hashtag, topic 2's challenge involves questions for her. And then Wednesday night at 9 p.m., so we've got a morning and an evening engagement. We have Mike Caulfield, and we're going to be talking about his 4 moves for digital and media literacies and sort of information literacy and dealing with disinformation. So we've got a lot of interesting places to go from here into, okay, we've had this conversation about polarization. We're starting to try to get a sense of the ways that it's affecting us. What do we do now? So I hope you can join us. Thank you very much for being with us today. This was really, really interesting.